Good morning and welcome all to the second of three parts of the Congressional Western Caucus series, Biden's Executive Disorder, an Attack on American Energy. I'm Dan Newhouse from Central Washington's 4th Congressional District, and I am proud to serve as chairman of the Congressional Western Caucus. Yesterday, we held our first hearing of this series, looking at the devastating impacts of President Biden's executive orders on rural communities, specifically hearing from county and education leaders in the states of Utah and New Mexico. I've got to say, yesterday's testimony was not only sobering, but it was incredibly heartfelt, as well as hearing about the human impacts and the harmful tolls being placed upon our communities in the West. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two good friends, both of whom are strong leaders within the Congressional Western Caucus. Vice Chair Liz Cheney from Wyoming, and Representative Jodey Arrington from Texas. I want to thank you both for being here for an important conversation. This morning's second hearing of our series is going to focus on the impacts of the executive orders, including the moratorium on federal oil and gas leasing and the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline on our nation's industry and our economy. And I've got to say, I'm just incredibly impressed by the stature of the panelists that we have testifying this morning. And I'm really looking forward to hearing their testimony. After 4 years of significant efforts to secure our nation's energy independence, including becoming a net exporter of oil for the first time in decades, President Biden dealt America's energy industry a devastating blow with just a few flicks of his pen. Just 1 week into his presidency. Members of the Congressional Western Caucus have been outspoken in our opposition to these actions and will continue to support policies that support continued work to achieve American energy dominance, as well as to encourage policies that further economic growth for our nation and its local communities, not policies that impede or restrict it. Before I turn it over to my colleagues for their opening statements, I also have to flag that as we speak this morning, the House is set to vote on legislation later today that will only further contribute to the hampering of American energy and resource development. The lands package is on the floor before us today, and it will lock down millions of acres of land in the West, not only from energy development, but also from public access. It's truly a shame, and I'm proud of my colleagues in the Western Caucus for doing everything in our power to stop this. With that, again, thank you to all who are watching. I would now like to turn it over to my esteemed Vice Chair Liz Cheney for her opening statements. Ms. Cheney?
Well, thank you so much, Dan, Chairman Newhouse. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for making sure that Western Caucus is playing such a crucial role in this issue that matters not only to those of us who represent energy producing states and districts, but to the whole country. And so it's an honor to be here with you today and with our colleague, Jodey Arrington, as well as with our tremendous witnesses, including Tim Considine from the University of Wyoming. And so I look forward very much to this hearing and to being able to continue to focus on and bring a spotlight on the real devastation we've seen from the Biden administration executive orders. We've seen, as you've discussed, that the administration is willing, in their misguided haste to end fossil fuel production, they're willing to destroy millions of jobs, to deny communities hundreds of millions of dollars that we use to fund education, infrastructure, healthcare resources, and other critical programs. We've seen this both with respect to the impacts of President Biden's executive order that would place an indefinite moratorium on federal oil and gas leasing. We've seen the effect that energy costs will rise, domestic energy production will fall, jobs will be lost, and the individuals who can least afford it will bear the brunt of this action by the Biden administration. Not only that, but this moratorium will diminish our ability to produce energy domestically, to maintain energy independence, and will force us back to the days when we had to rely on adversaries for our energy production, and that obviously undermines our national security interests. While the president, the vice president, the Biden administration claim that this ban is some sort of an effort to address climate change, the reality is the ban will do nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Adversely, it will disproportionately impact middle and low income families and communities in rural states across the West, like Wyoming, with large percentages of our land, federal land. The ban will limit production on federal lands, but it won't limit production overall. The demand for oil and gas will remain the same. So it merely shifts production to other areas of the country, disproportionately hurting states like Wyoming, or to foreign countries. In my home state, which ranks first in federal natural gas production, second in federal oil production, the effects will be real, they will be harmful. Not only will the moratorium destroy jobs, it will also cost the state over $150 million annually in K through 12 funding, millions more for critical infrastructure and other services. This moratorium will facilitate the loss of one of the most significant sources of federal revenue during a time of record federal deficits and results in a decrease of the US gross domestic product by $700 billion. Not only that, the ban will cause a net increase of crude imports by 2 million barrels per day, which will weaken US energy and national security, increasing our trade deficit and our reliance on foreign nations. We'll also see a reduction in critical energy supplies for Americans to heat their homes and fuel their cars, as well as impacts to manufacturing feedstocks and the development of critical products. The executive order, the same one that places a ban on federal oil and gas leasing, also directs the Interior Department to outline steps to achieve President Biden's goal of conserving at least additionally 30% of our lands and waters by the year 2030. This also would create a significant gap in conservation funding. The administration failed to take into account that billions of dollars in revenues from oil and gas leasing and production go to conservation every year. They go, for example, to the Democratic championed Land and Water Conservation Fund. The 30 by 30 goal is an additional effort by executive order for the Biden administration to lock up federal acreage from multiple use through permanent protection. The administration must remember that federal lands are here to benefit the American people. Multiple use means multiple use. Every American has a place on our public lands, and multiple use lands should not be locked up as wilderness areas, thus denying our ability to use those lands for grazing, for energy production, for recreation. The longer the moratorium remains in effect, the more significant the personal, individual, and economic impact will be on citizens across the country. Despite the rhetoric we've seen from the administration, unfortunately, these initial moves are nothing short of heartless. They damage the economy, they damage the energy industry, they damage our families, they take away jobs, they hurt individuals. They're really misguided efforts to placate the far left. And I'm hopeful that the administration will rethink these efforts and will turn them around through efforts like the one we're engaged in today. So with that, let me thank you very much, Chairman Newhouse, and I'll turn things back over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cheney. Appreciate you being here with us this morning. Great, sobering comments that we'll expand on this morning. I'd like to now turn to my good friend, but true leader for American energy dominance, Representative Jodey Arrington from the 19th Congressional District of the great state of Texas. Jodey?
The food, fuel, and fiber capital of the world. And I'm proud to be part of the Western Caucus. And as I mentioned, and I wasn't saying this, I was saying it in a serious way, the Western culture of hard work, independence, patriotism, and the premium on free people, free markets, and free states. And that system to develop and steward our resources has been a huge blessing to this country and a huge boon to our economic prosperity, our energy independence that has supported as a cornerstone of our national security. I hail from the Lone Star State. We don't have a lot of federal lands. We are the lead oil and gas producing state. We have about a third of the refining capacity. We've got about twice as much trade as the next largest trading state, so lots of emphasis on exporting. LNG's been a game changer. We hit an ocean of natural gas with technology, by the way, not developed by the federal government, but because of the incentives of the free enterprise system. And that natural gas has not only made energy for consumers, for working families, more affordable and more reliable, but it has allowed us to reduce greenhouse gases and have a cleaner air, and we're contributing to that not only here in the United States, where we lead the world in stewarding our environment, but we're trading in this LNG to help lower greenhouse gases around the world. So I am very proud of the hardworking, God-fearing folks in rural America who just, they just want to provide for their families and have a good, hard, honest day's work. And in, one day, as you said, Chairman Newsom, with the flick of a pen, 11,000 of them working on the Keystone Pipeline to only enhance North American energy dominance, they found themselves without a job. Here's a telling fact that you guys might not know, Chairwoman Cheney and Chairman Newhouse. During the markup of the so-called COVID relief plan, which we know is 2/3 really a bailout and windfall, et cetera, there was great concern expressed by, and rightfully so, by American people and working families who, by no fault of their own, had their lives turned upside down because of the pandemic and government shutdown orders and other mandates. And we all wanted to help and figure out ways to help. I had an idea. There were similar working families whose lives were turned upside down by no fault of their own. And it was actually because of a unilateral executive action by this president. And I said, as we extend COBRA care, healthcare, to support healthcare and the connection to these families and their employers' health benefits, let's extend that to the 11,000 families whose lives were forever changed and who are now in despair about how they're going to make ends meet, pay the bills, and make a living. And it was just completely rejected down the line by every Democrat on that committee. It's heartbreaking. Liz mentioned a lot of the statistics, and I won't be able to say them better in terms of all the manifold ways that fossil fuels have strengthened our nation, and all the manifold disastrous ways these Biden unilateral actions and probably the onslaught of regulations and more mandates and interventions by this administration are going to hurt, let's just say, the quality of life and standard of living that we enjoy on just about every front. Testing drugs, manufacturing drugs, medical devices, clothes that we wear. There are not many places you can go. There are not many touch points in our society with products that aren't supported in part by petrochemicals, by the basis of fossil resources. So I think there's a fundamental question here, though, Chairman Newhouse and Chairwoman Cheney and my friends and distinguished panelists. What's driving this? I think Liz is right. Joe Biden, President Biden, he'll do whatever he needs to do to be liked and to get elected because he's a 50-year politician and that's what they do. And this is the era of AOC and the Green New Disaster. So he's going to placate to the left, and the left is pretty mean about it, and they're pretty religious in their zeal, and they're pretty darn extreme in their ideology on this. At some point, we've got to recognize that that's what's driving it, and we better win hearts and minds of the younger generations as to how we can how we can manage our resources and steward our environment, and why fossil energy is so critical to not only our quality of life, but to the billion people that are in energy poverty, and all the ways we help our neighbors around the globe. So that's our big challenge. Chairman Newsom, thanks for including me on today's in today's discussion. Again, honored to be part of the Western Caucus. And to our panelists, thank you for your time and your insights today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Arrington. Sobering comments and a very valid challenge that we have in front of us. Now I'd like to turn to our panelists. First, I'd like to invite Ms. Cheney to please introduce our first panelist from the great state of Wyoming. And before you begin, just to remind everybody to please unmute yourself before it's time for your time to speak, and then please mute yourself back when it's time to move on to the next speaker. So Ms. Cheney, please let us begin.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, and thanks to Jodey for those important comments about the challenges that we're all facing together. And I'm very honored that we are able to have join us this morning Dr. Tim Considine from the University of Wyoming. Dr. Considine is a professor of economics in the Department of Economics at the School of Energy Resources. And his research on petroleum market analysis has been published in top economics journals around the world. Last year, in particular, he conducted a study on the fiscal and economic impacts of federal onshore oil and gas lease moratorium and drilling ban policies. He analyzed the effects of precisely this kind of leasing and or drilling moratorium in several states, including Wyoming. Dr. Considine has also worked as an economist at the Bank of America and is the lead analyst for natural gas deregulation at the U.S. Congressional Budget Office. And we're really thrilled to have him here this morning to share his expertise and give us some advice about the way forward. So with that, I will recognize Dr. Considine.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Representative Cheney and Chairman Newhouse. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about my study. I prepared some remarks. My recent study estimates the investment and production losses from policies to restrict federal onshore oil and gas development in 8 Western states. These states include North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, California, and Alaska. These fiscal and economic losses are estimated by projecting drilling and production from 2021 through 2040 based upon forecasts for oil and gas prices from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. My findings indicate that oil and gas well completions are projected to increase modestly over the next few years, but remain below previous peaks. To project oil and gas production associated with these well completions, my study captures the unique features of unconventional oil and gas production technology, in which high initial production is followed by steep production decline thereafter. This feature raises the importance of drilling new wells to offset the production decline from previously completed ones. Indeed, in recent years, oil and gas production has been increasing in many Western states as new, highly productive wells exceed the production decline from old wells. If pursued, the Biden administration's policies threaten to undo this progress, choking off the flow of investment capital to Western states by 30 to 40 billion and leading to a sharp reduction in oil and gas production of 27 to 36 billion over the next 5 years. Lost investment and production translate into lower severance and ad valorem tax revenues, employment, and gross domestic product. Lost oil and gas tax revenue is between 8 and 10 billion over the next 5 years. Gross domestic product is 46 to 57 billion lower over the initial 5 years of restrictions. Average annual employment losses are between 58 and 72,000. If these policies remain in place over the long term, the fiscal and economic losses are much larger, losses in the value of oil and gas production and gross domestic product are over 400 and 600 billion respectively during the next 20 years under these policies. The corresponding losses in oil and gas tax revenues are 120 billion. These loss estimates are conservative and could be larger for several reasons. First, my study assumes a conservative productivity growth rate of 1.2% per annum for initial oil and gas production. If productivity increases by 3% per year, for example, fiscal and economic losses under Biden's policy would be 25% higher than my baseline estimates. Secondly, the opportunity costs of lost investment and production rise with higher oil and natural gas prices. For instance, if oil prices increase 10%, my estimated oil tax losses are up to 27% higher than the baseline estimates. Third reason involves spillovers, and this could be important. Federal regulations could apply to private and state lands subject to agreements to combine acreage to improve production efficiencies. These are called communitization agreements. The result is that for states with significant federal acreage, like Wyoming, rules like a drilling ban could apply to state and private land as well. These impacts are proportional to the land areas affected, so that a 10% spillover affecting private and state lands would increase the losses by another 10%. The United States is the largest oil and gas producer in the world, deterring OPEC from cutting production to increase prices. Halting oil and gas development on federal lands reduces an important source of incremental supply to world markets, increasing OPEC's market power and ultimately transferring income from American consumers to foreign oil producers. At least 2/3 of lost federal onshore production likely would be offset by increased production from other areas, primarily overseas. In this case, the implicit greenhouse gas emission abatement costs from these policies average over $390 per ton. By comparison, the carbon price from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in California is $15 per ton. There are many cost-effective technologies and strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Restricting development on oil and gas on federal lands is not one of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Considine. Truly staggering numbers. I can't wait to get into the lines of questioning so we can further explore those. Ms. Cheney, could you introduce our second panelist from the Cowboy State this morning?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate that. And thanks, Dr. Considine, for those remarks. Really look forward to the chance to ask questions. Now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Glen Murrell, who serves as the Executive Director of the Wyoming Energy Authority, an organization formed by the Wyoming State Legislature to support our state's growing energy sector. He'll be speaking about the detrimental effects of the recent oil and gas leasing moratorium on our energy industry and on our economy. Dr. Murrell previously worked for the University of Wyoming's Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute and has served in a variety of technology leadership roles in the oil and gas industry. And we look forward very much to hearing your comments. So with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Murrell.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair Cheney. First of all, I'd like to thank the Congressional Western Caucus, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair Cheney, Representative Arrington, my fellow panelists for the invitation to speak today. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Mr. Chairman, my opening statement today will sound very Wyoming-centric, which is to be expected given my role at the Energy Authority. However, I believe my comments can be considered in a very general context because while opinion, I am confident they are evidence-based, they are rational, and they're quite representative of my fellow Wyomingites and many others individuals in my neighboring Western states. And Mr. Chairman, Wyoming is blessed with a rich endowment of natural energy resources, both hydrocarbon-based and otherwise. Furthermore, the nation as a whole has relied on Wyoming and our resources to fuel its economy for decades and continues to do so. This is something that Wyoming is known for domestically and internationally, and is a point of great pride for Wyomingites. As a consequence of the role Wyoming has played in powering the nation, our economy and state finances are consequently heavily dependent on energy extraction and generation-based taxes and royalties. The role Wyoming's energy economy plays in the overall well-being and quality of life of our citizenry cannot be overstated. With a goal of continuing to fuel the nation, Wyoming has looked towards the future and invested in technologies that will meet market demands, while ensuring the state's energy strategy, embracing an all of the above energy mix, cognizant of and responsive to customer demands and environmental stewardship. In late January, the Biden administration issued orders that seek to limit future development of oil and gas resources on federal land. The impact of such decisions on Wyoming is disproportionate because of the large extent of federal lands within the state and the large proportion of oil and gas production that comes from access to federal mineral rights. And Vice Chair Cheney and my colleague, Professor Considine, have covered those details tremendously, so I'll skip a few pages here. But approximately 50% of current Wyoming oil production comes from federal land and nearly all natural gas production. And given that oil and gas production contributes about 1/3 of total contributions to the state general fund, it is consequently undeniable that these decisions will heavily impact the well-being of the state as a whole. So that's the entire economy of Wyoming will be impacted by these. And to what end? The decisions of the administration are purportedly driven by a desire to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, which is admirable. And I agree with Representative Arrington's point with respect to being aware and cognizant of our other constituents' viewpoints and perspectives of the energy environment mix. However, these executive orders will likely have little to no effect on emissions at all for one simple reason. They do not impact in any way consumption. They just simply do not touch consumption. The orders are not going to change how much people drive or how much they use air conditioning in the summer or heat in the winter, or their desire for high-tech consumer products or even high-quality food. All of these consumer needs are met with oil and gas resources, and the demand is not going away. What will happen is that the oil and gas will simply be sourced from other suppliers, not on federal lands. Maybe domestically, but most likely a mix of domestic and international producers will fill the void. It is actually conceivable, Mr. Chairman, that emissions will increase as a consequence of having to import hydrocarbon resources or having to tap supply that has less stringent production requirements than those imposed by the federal permitting process. So, Mr. Chairman, we find ourselves in a situation where a policy initiative or policy decision is extremely inefficient, meaning that for the intent in which it's driven is almost minimal, it's almost negligible. But it's also disproportionately punitive and imposes grossly unfair economic hardship on communities and societies that take great pride in the role they have played in delivering the energy-enabled high standard of living enjoyed by all Americans. And this is personally the most frustrating piece of this. Given the ambition of the policy, there are simply better ways to do it. It did not have to be done this way. If the Biden administration desires to make a tangible difference in emissions and face the challenges that confront the nation, then there are alternative approaches with policy and technology and actions that are far more effective, unifying, respectful, and equitable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murrell. Wow, sobering comments. Can't wait to further explore those in our line of questioning as well. Mr. Arrington, if you could please do us the honor of introducing our third and final panelist from the great state of Texas.
Well, you're gracious to call me by my real last name, even though I've been calling you Newsom. Dan's a good friend. I think I have an ex-girlfriend from college with the last name Newsom, and I never got over her. And I'm sorry that it worked its way out into this live broadcast.
That's just a little troubling, Jodey.
Way too much information also, but.
Listen, it is what a distinguished panel, really, and the previous speakers provided great insight. I can't wait for the Q&A portion. So let me just say that we have a leader in public policy and someone with great legislative experience in the Texas legislature. He worked for a good friend of mine from the Lower Concho Valley, that's San Angelo, America, and Drew Darby, who was chair of the Texas House Energy Resources Committee. He was also a staff member, senior staff person for the Texas Railroad Commission. That's our energy commission there in the state. But now he's president of the Texas Alliance for Energy Producers. And the independent producers, which are predominantly his members, 2,600 of them, it is a robust, dynamic economy there that has created technologies and efficiencies, the likes of which no one can replicate around the world because of that dynamism in the independent oil and gas producer market. So Jason, thank you for joining us. Jason Modglin, ladies and gentlemen, from the great state of Texas.
Well, thank you, Congressman, and thank you, Chairman Newhouse, Congresswoman Cheney, and Congressman Arrington again for the invitation to be here. My name is Jason Modglin. I serve as president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. We're a trade organization based in Texas, representing over 2,600 individuals and member companies. And we're focused on advancing independent operators, particularly small and family-run operations, and the standards of the oil and gas industry. Texas is home for most of our members, but many have operations across the country, and we represent the upstream segment of the oil and gas industry. We have a 90-year history as an association, and many of our members are multi-generational oil field, part of the proud history of American oil and gas that helped this country end 2 world wars, produce the fuels and feedstocks to power our economy, and provide the innovation to meet the world's energy demands. It's an honor to be with you and the Congressional Western Caucus to amplify the voice of men and women working in rural America that are being harmed by federal policies that limit investment in infrastructure and the harvesting of our natural resources. Thank you for your attention to 2 key issues brought on by recent executive orders. First, on federal leasing and permitting restrictions, energy produced on federal lands and waters plays a critical role in America's energy revolution. It accounts for 12% of U.S. natural gas production and nearly a quarter of U.S. oil production. Unlike other Western states, as Congressman Arrington mentioned, Texas has a small portion of onshore federal lands that would be impacted directly by these orders, but that by no means diminishes the great benefit each year from sales by the Bureau of Land Management that we've been able to take advantage of for leases on federal lands, allowing operators to extend horizontal well laterals into federal land when they're developing adjacent plays. This minimizes surface damages and provides for additional revenue to the state of Texas and the federal government. The main impact in Texas will be challenges to offshore leasing and permitting. Offshore production, the majority of which is in the Gulf of Mexico, is one of the largest U.S. oil plays. Roughly 71% of all oil production on U.S. federal lands and waters, and about 17% of total U.S. oil production comes from federal waters along the Gulf Coast. In fiscal year 2020, more than $95.3 million was distributed to Texas and its counties thanks to Congress's actions on the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act. In September of last year, the American Petroleum Institute commissioned a study of the impact of a total interruption of federal leasing and permitting. In their study, they found that Texas would lose an astounding 120,000 jobs. Beyond that devastation of losing good paying jobs in a great industry, these policies would decimate our nearly 50-year national energy policy to seek energy independence and resilience. From their report, they reported that U.S. oil imports from foreign sources could increase by 2 million barrels a day, that our gas exports could decrease by 800 BCF on an annualized basis, that our GDP would decline by a cumulative 700 billion, and that we would lose nearly 1 million jobs across the country. And what that would result in is US households spending a cumulative $19 billion more on energy by 2030. Most frustrating of all of these executive orders, and I'm glad the other panelists touched on these, is how they have profound negative environmental impacts. Constraining production in the United States does not lessen demand. That demand shifts to other sources overseas, namely OPEC+, which do not have the same environmental or labor standards as this country. Please, if you can convey one message to your colleagues, it is this: constraining production in the United States does not lessen our demand. This country relies on oil and gas and will get it from somewhere. The hundreds of thousands of Texas families employed in our domestic industry can meet that need and do so to the high standard this country has set for business and industry. I was heartened by your colleague, Congresswoman Deb Haaland's comments this week in her Senate confirmation hearing for Secretary of Interior that the ban will not be permanent. But let's remember that slow is the same as no in preventing investment, jobs, and returns for the American taxpayer. Offshore production has been exceptionally good for America and our Gulf Coast. Combined with the shale development, affordable, abundant, and reliable natural gas has remade our coastlines, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. In Texas alone, manufacturing accounts for nearly 1 million jobs. Second, on pipeline restrictions, specifically the Keystone XL pipeline, the southern portion of the Keystone pipeline running through Texas has been operating for over 5 years, providing a critical conduit for production coming to Cushing, Oklahoma from the Midwest and making its way to critical refineries and export facilities along our Gulf Coast. The order denying the presidential permit across the border stopped ongoing work and harmed union jobs. Pipelines are without a doubt the safest way to transport oil and gas, and the only way to safely move gas over land, Stopping a pipeline, a bridge to our #1 trading partner in Canada, does not stop that trade. Instead, that movement will be facilitated by costlier train or truck traffic. Tying up trains to move oil drives up prices for transport in America's breadbasket, harming our farmers and consumers. A prominent agricultural economist estimated shutting down a pipeline would cost Corn Belt farmers more than $1 billion in annual revenue and drive up food costs for consumers, as oil would command key space on railroad cars needed to transport agricultural products long distances. Transporting oil by pipeline is not only more cost effective, but also better for our environment. A 2017 study published by the Environmental Science and Technology found pipeline transportation produced between 61 and 77% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than rail. Infrastructure is a public good that we should prioritize as a nation. Building back better means investing in pipelines and strengthening our trade corridors. The events of the past week in Texas and across the nation show we need more energy, not less. The ability for energy sources to meet demand relies on robust infrastructure. This nation, along with our neighbors, have achieved North American energy independence by building on the production and supply from the US and Canada and a rapidly growing gas market in Mexico that is demanding modernization. This is at risk under the administration's policies, resulting in higher energy costs to American consumers and increasing imports from other parts of the globe. Returning to a reliance on OPEC+ is a major step backwards and a reversal of US energy renaissance that we've achieved over the last 15 years. Finally, litmus tests designed to end American production of fuels, petrochemicals, and natural gas are wrong. I mentioned at the start, Alliance members support advancing the standards of the oil and gas industry. We have made tremendous progress and continue to make leaps and bounds in innovation, resulting in lower emissions, effective protection of our groundwater, and affordable, abundant, reliable power and feedstocks for American need. Let us compete and meet the world's energy demands as well. Thank you, Congressman Arrington, for the invitation, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Modglin. I appreciate those comments, and I've got some questions for you, but I believe Congresswoman Cheney has a commitment that she's got to get to. So Liz, I'm going to jump ahead to you for your 5 minutes of questioning, and just to remind everybody about the mute button. You know how to work that, and so Ms. Cheney, please proceed.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, and thanks very much to all of our witnesses this morning. I wanted to talk to both, ask both of Dr. Considine and Dr. Murrell, to talk some more about the impact of this ban, given the checkerboard pattern. And I think both of you began to talk about this a little bit in your remarks, but I think it's helpful for people to understand the extent to which state lands and private lands, private owners will also be impacted greatly by this. And so maybe I'll go first to Dr. Considine. If you could talk about the impact of this ban, in particular, how it would be implemented, what it would mean, and just describe for people a little bit about how the land is in a checkerboard pattern. We're not talking about vast swaths of one or the other here.
Yes, be happy to address that, Representative Cheney. In the West, primarily in Wyoming and Utah, when the Union Pacific Railroad was built a century ago, the government gave the railroad access, and later that land was redistributed to private landowners and the state. So if you look at a map of Wyoming and Utah in particular, this also occurs in New Mexico to a somewhat lesser extent, you have a checkerboard pattern of, I think it's 3 mile by 3 mile blocks of land, one federal, one state, and it alternates in that pattern. There are also some tribal lands further north in Wyoming. And what that means is that if you identify oil, say on a private parcel, and the laterals extend it to private and state land, you need to seek permission from those other landowners to access those resources. Also, there's surface access issues as well, such as pipelines and roads and so on. So the concern is that restricting development on the federal parcels will make it more difficult to produce oil and gas on the private and adjacent private and state lands. I looked at the possibility that these restrictions would affect 10% of private and state land, which means my impacts would be 10% higher than I reported in my findings. The difficulty to put numbers on it is we don't have any historical experience of the government doing this. So it could be a real wild card and really even more adversely affect production in New Mexico, Wyoming, and Utah. Also, Western Colorado is another area with this checkerboard pattern.
Thank you. And for Dr. Murrell, you mentioned the punitive nature of these executive orders and the extent to which they're targeting our communities, they're targeting individuals and workers who, as you said, take great pride in being able to produce the energy that has powered the nation. Can you, and you began to discuss some other alternatives, some other ways that we could get at some of the issues the administration says it's concerned about. I wonder if you could elaborate on both of those pieces of your opening remarks.
Thank you, Vice Chair Cheney. So you're right. There are certain societies and communities within Wyoming which will be hit hard by this. They're generational workers in the oil and gas space in various parts in the Powder River Basin and Greater Green River Basin, for example. Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. They have taken great pride in the role that they have played, not only within the Wyoming oil and gas business, but in supplying high quality energy to many neighboring states in general, and the well-being and standard of living that those consumers have enjoyed because of the hard work they have employed. So there's a lot of pride in that space, and these actions, at least at face value, seem to be very disrespectful to that history. which is disappointing because many of those same operators have a shared ambition with those consumer markets. Those consumer markets have a tendency to have increasing demand for low emissions energy, and that's matched by these very same communities and societies within Wyoming, which is not a surprise really. Wyoming has spent more than a decade pursuing low emissions energy through policy and technology. You can go and talk to any hunting group within Wyoming, and the first thing they'll start talking about is conservation and environmental protections. So it's not surprising, although I'm sure many neighboring states might be quite surprised by that aspect, that Wyoming communities and societies have a shared ambition with those common consumer markets. Changing gear there a little bit to the alternatives. I'm a technologist, and I have great faith, and I think the world has seen many times how technology can rise to meet any sort of market demand or market concern. The alternatives that present themselves today are very much focused on that key problem statement: that consumers want low emissions energy. Okay, so that actually opens up a lot of solution space. There are aspects that can address the emissions-rich energy sources that we have, so we can preserve our hydrocarbon heritage and apply various technologies like carbon capture and utilization and storage to take care of that carbon emission from the production and consumption of the resource. The role of hydrogen sector in the near to medium future is incredible. The potential there is quite spectacular. The more you look at it, the role that hydrogen could play to mitigate hydrocarbon resources, but also enhance renewable resources, is incredible. Wyoming's very well positioned for that, and it is all enabled by carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There are net neutral emission sources, like the increasing role of renewable sources. Although I have to admit that I believe the goal of having renewables displace the entire thermal fleet is difficult to imagine for engineering and societal reasons. So hydrocarbons will have to continue to be part of the mix, but they can be better through technology. And there's also the aspect of net negative technologies, renewable-based direct air capture, but even the role of agriculture for sequestration and nature-based sequestration efforts as well is all there. So that's what I mean by alternatives. It's simply, my fellow panelist, Mr. Modglin, mentioned, that there are alternatives that are fair and reasonable, and it shouldn't be based on simply slow or no in terms of the way to move forward.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for your time today. Thanks to all of our witnesses and to Chairman Newhouse for taking the focus and the initiative on this really critical issue for us across the country, but especially in Wyoming and Texas and all the Western states. And so I appreciate very much the opportunity to participate and look forward to additional discussions and conversations on these key issues. So thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you, Liz. And I understand you may have to go to another commitment, but I just want to say you've been a tremendous leader on this really important issue, not just for your own state of Wyoming, but for the entire nation. And I appreciate that very much. And
so have you as well as Jodey. So thank you very much. Thanks for your leadership of the Western Caucus.
Absolutely.
Chairman Newhouse, I think it's notable that our friend Liz has tremendous responsibilities as the chair of our conference. We have a major piece of legislation that she is having to shepherd the conference around for many reasons. And for her to take an hour out of her time to join this conversation says a lot, volumes about her seriousness and her leadership and her commitment to defending and promoting conventional fuels, fossil fuels, and all these things that have made our country so much better. So anyway, thank you, Liz, for your leadership on this. It's making a difference.
Thanks, Jodey. I appreciate that. Thanks, everybody, very much. We'll see everybody soon.
Awesome. No, thank you. Thank you, Jodey. Thank you, Liz. So let me dive into the discussion just a little bit myself. Got a couple of questions that after listening to your testimonies. I'll start with you, Dr. Considine. I just wanted to kind of get back to some of the numbers that you were providing us. Staggering is one of the words that comes to mind when you were expressing some of the costs, lost oil revenues, and lost, excuse me, tax revenues, the impact of the GDP. So I guess I'd just like to give you an opportunity to highlight some of those things. I think they bear repeating. If you wouldn't mind providing us again with that kind of an overview of what you see there.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Chairman Newhouse. Yeah, those are a good question. They are big numbers. When I was first doing this study, running the numbers, I just looked at them and I thought, this is bad. You know, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach because I live in Wyoming. I've lived out here since 2008. I formerly worked at Penn State University, and I did a study as I was leaving in 2008, 2009 on the Marcellus Shale. And I predicted that the Marcellus Shale would be the largest one of the largest natural gas fields in the world. People didn't believe me. And Pennsylvania gained enormously from that gas boom. Manufacturing returning to Pittsburgh, of all places. And when I moved out here, I realized that gas production in Wyoming was beginning to decline. And so when I started running these numbers, you know, there's a lot of numbers in the report. I break down the losses in tax revenues and GDP and employment by state. And just take Wyoming, for instance. I mentioned my analysis was conservative, and in Wyoming alone, we're talking about losses in oil and gas revenues, just oil and gas revenues of 180 to 200 million in the first few years under the leasing ban. That does not include additional sales tax losses from lower business activity, which adds another 100 million to it. Okay, so that's kind of the orders of magnitude. You know, that's equal to the budget of more than 3 times the budget of the University of Wyoming, or the appropriation from the state. And what really was surprising was, to me, were the losses in tax revenues to New Mexico. In New Mexico alone, you're looking at numbers, annual tax revenue losses just from oil and gas of between 600 million initially, and then it grows over time to $1 billion. So that's $1 billion hit on the New Mexico state budget. And that's just from ad valorem and severance taxes. And then the other taxes, the income taxes, the property taxes, the sales taxes, take another multi-$100 million hit, starting at 169, going up to $400 million a year. Okay, so you're talking about blowing a hole in the budgets of New Mexico and Wyoming alone. Now, the other states like Utah, Western Colorado is going to get hit hard because most of the West Slope gas that's produced is on federal land. Okay. And again, you know, Colorado has a big diversified economy, but it really hits hard those local governments and special districts, conservation districts, library districts. A lot of those operations are funded by ad valorem or property tax revenues on oil and gas properties. And, you know, when there are fewer coming in and lower volumes of product being produced, there's just lower revenue to local governments. So that kind of gives you an idea. North Dakota is another place where you're looking at budget hits of in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And the place that really will get hurt medium and long term is Alaska. Alaska was poised to open up the National Petroleum Reserve to drilling. And I initially had overlooked that in my initial analysis and included it at the end. And that's significant, okay? And it builds over time. And then around 2030, just 9 years from now, we're looking at the possibility of drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. And that's a very significant source of oil and revenues to the state of Alaska, and also of great strategic significance to world oil markets. Keep in mind, one of the reasons OPEC was broken in the early 80s was Alaska. Alaska oil production went from nothing to 2 million barrels per day in the early 1980s. Now we're down to about 500,000 barrels per day, and ANWR will bring Alaska back probably to over 1 million barrels per day if development is allowed, okay? So that has implications for, and you put all this together, all these pieces, all these states, all this federal production, it's significant. It's it may be only 1 or 2% of world supply, but that's all you need to affect price at the margin.
Good, good. Thank you. Well, I think we need to do all we can to amplify just exactly what you're saying. And so thank you for giving us that information. And we need your voice, and we need all your voices here in Congress to tell this story. Dr. Murrell, maybe this is an unfair question to you, but I was, a couple of weeks ago, I went to the state of South Dakota and visited with some folks that are trying to deal with the decision to stop the Keystone Pipeline. Just truly an economic kick in the gut to these communities. And I wonder if you could, if you could tell us a little bit about what the state of Wyoming may be doing to try to prepare for the consequences of some of these executive actions. Or our state leaders, and certainly I'm sure they're concerned, they're worried about things. Do you see any actions being taken or considered, or what are their options?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's the first part, the Keystone is nuanced and multifaceted, and it has near field effects, and the decision has near field effects for those states and communities directly impacted, and far field effects down in Texas, for example, that permeates the entire country in some ways. In Wyoming, the effect is, or the missed opportunity, the opportunity cost, I guess, of not proceeding with Keystone, is that if it had been built, it would have removed certain transportation bottlenecks in the area from Alberta, Saskatchewan, through the Dakotas, and so on. The export of oil creates a bottleneck for operators within Wyoming to get their oil to market, and consequently, there's a price discount locally within Wyoming. So the opportunity cost is that discount will remain in place until something else comes along and addresses it. So that's the direct and immediate impact to Wyoming from that decision. But it is a very nuanced issue, and everybody will have a different view, whether it's prices or labor unions and everything else. It's very, very complicated. With respect to the orders in general and what the state can do, it's tough. My colleague Professor Considine mentioned certain states that will get impacted in very local areas or small areas. For states like Wyoming and New Mexico, the hit is so big. If they really do come into effect, and then it will take time to work through inventory and otherwise, but for example, if it does come into effect as it looks like right now, in 3 years' time, then it's reasonable to see that the government general fund will take a 25% cut on an annual basis. That's just doing rough numbers. You don't have to look at any fancy model to figure that out. That's just the raw data. And that's a challenge. And if anybody has a solution for how the state of Wyoming can fill a 25% hole in their budget, I'm very interested, because there's not really a lot we can do. So we have to try and prevent that ban from taking place. That's the only thing we really can do. The technology is not going to fill a 25% hole. When it's just a flat ban, which will, cover 100% of our natural gas production, for example. Even technologies that I mentioned earlier, the prospect of hydrogen will be impacted by that decision. That's an unforeseen consequence of that. The blue hydrogen sector will be done. There is none if we're unable to produce natural gas. So it is in our best interest to prevent the ban from becoming a reality. And the governor has been very proactive with working with neighboring state governors, gubernatorial representation to present this position to the federal government and show how impactful it is, as well as present the alternatives that I mentioned earlier, as there are better solutions than this. Slow or no is not a solution, it's reaction. And there are ways to work through these challenges in a productive and equitable fashion. So that's the approach generally. It's manifesting in various communication efforts currently, as much vocal pressure and educational sort of communication as we possibly can do is really the emphasis today.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Murrell.
You're welcome.
So we obviously are under a time constraint, and I do have questions for Mr. Modglin, but I just wanted to highlight one thing you said: constraining production does not lessen demand. And I think people have to really think about that and let that sink in. It's going to come at tremendous extra cost. But I want to move to Congressman Arrington, allow Jodey to ask his questions, and I appreciate very much so far the information that we've heard. So Jodey, could you go ahead, and I'll let you have the floor.
Thank you, Dan. So the cumulative effect of it's hard to wrap your mind around all the blows absorbed by this industry that we've already articulated is critical to our economic growth and prosperity and our national security. Do you think about the international supply side crisis, and then you have the demand crisis because of COVID and shutdowns. Now a domestic supply potential crisis with that was self-inflicted because of an ideology, in my opinion, and the politics around that ideology that makes the government now hostile to this industry. But taking all of that and not even factoring in higher taxes that will come, I don't know how one can move this country forward and produce the kind of positive impacts with all of these going on. But the Paris Climate Accord may be the most widespread and long-term disastrous of all. And again, we don't have the federal lands, Dan, that Wyoming and other states do. But you look at the millions of jobs in the next 20 years, not to mention how foolish it is to give a pass to China, India, those who are the chief polluters. There is nothing that makes sense about this. But let's talk about the impact to the independent oil and gas producers. 91% of the wells, Dan, are being developed, and 83% of the oil and gas in this country is produced by these small businesses, essentially, small, medium-sized businesses. How do they survive, Jason? What is the impact on this piece of the energy ecosystem, right? So explain what that will happen, and especially around the Paris Climate Accord, as if one can fathom all the layers of negative impact here.
Yes, sir. Well, Congressman, they continue to get leaner. Unfortunately, we do a Texas Petroleum Index, and our petroleum economist, Cara Ingham, has reported that last year was just devastating to Texas oil and gas upstream operators, losing some 25% of the industry and nearly some of our lowest numbers since 2005 on employment of about 160,000 upstream jobs. That translates to a much higher number when you start to include midstream and downstream jobs, but our focus is on upstream. And last year, those men and women in that industry were able to generate $13.9 billion to the state of Texas in terms of tax revenue, severance taxes paid, and also royalties paid in to the state to help with transportation, with public education, and with water infrastructure, which is critical in West Texas to everyone. Paris climate's a definite challenge, but look, Wyoming has been able to solve clean coal, and we have growing coal demand every year in the world. Unleash Wyoming to solve the world's problems. Look, the World Health Organization reports that 4 million people a year die from indoor air pollution. It's because they're not burning coal, they're not burning natural gas, they're burning wood, they're burning dung, and they're burning other biomass in stoves and home hearths. Wyoming can solve it. Texas can solve it as well by exporting liquefied natural gas to over 36 countries around the world, driving down their emissions, modernizing their manufacturing, and allowing for those feedstocks to then be fed into fertilizers and other things to allow agricultural production to increase overseas, particularly in Europe. I mean, these are the opportunities that we have. And that's why so many of you and your colleagues have called for, let's model it after what Texas, what Pittsburgh, what others have done to move this country forward, do it environmentally safe and responsible, but allow for us to solve some of the energy problems around the world.
Chairman, may I ask one more question?
Please do, Jodey, please.
Well, there's so many. I'm like Chairman Newhouse. I think ultimately, guys, because we are all preaching to the choir, we're all singing in the choir off the same song sheet. We have to figure out fundamentally, okay, at a root level, what has influenced the culture of America to adopt these dangerous policies. And I think they are dangerous. I think this, along with our national debt, may be the twin towers of robbing the next generation of Americans from the liberties and opportunities like no other generation before them. So and that's philosophical and all. Let me ask a practical question so we don't have to get too philosophical here. What's the next wave that's coming that we need to, as lawmakers, as voices and champions for the pro-energy policies that have made America exceptional in all the ways that we've articulated? What do Dan, Liz, and I need to anticipate is coming next? And Jason, maybe you can kick it off, and maybe Dr. Murrell and Dr. Considine can also provide their thoughts. And thank you for the opportunity. Congressman,
we're very concerned about some of the tax conversations taking place to raise taxes on American producers. Some $4 billion that was projected on an annualized basis to raise on the backs of American producers. That is very concerning. We're also worried about the regulatory state continuing to grow. And so whether that's endangered species or other types of environmental regulations that are new and imposed that don't meet practical standards. So those are two items that are of frontline concern to us as we watch this administration make their appointees.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The one thing I would like to comment on is simply I'm not sure people are aware that as I'm going to get a little bit technical here, forgive me, but as economies grow and develop, the energy demand, total energy demand, does not continue to increase over time. What we see is that energy demand, total demand, flattens. And in some economies that it's actually dipping already. Total energy consumption is dipping. But what is most important in that is that the shape of the demand is also changing. And then that on the consumer end, there is increasing prevalence of electricity as the primary consumptive energy base. So everything you do is cell phones, electric vehicles, electric airplanes, electrification of rail, electrification of manufacturing, the gigafactories of 2 million square feet of solar panels on their roof. It is becoming more and more prevalent. And the reason that is so important, and I don't think people are missing a trick here, but Wyoming's keeping an eye on it, is that particularly for an economy like Wyoming, our resources are in the solid form, liquid form, gaseous form, but our consumers want it in electrical form. And that is a very important and increasingly important aspect of our economy in general, because this is going to be a national issue, is how do we address those aspects of taking a solid, liquid, or gaseous form of energy and delivering it to the consumer in electrical form that is acceptable and has low emissions attached to it. So with respect to how can the legislators and lawmakers make a difference, just be aware of that, because there are aspects of the economy that are coming which will dictate. I believe that there's a possibility for policy to be unaware of that aspect and in consequence be constraining once you put it together. So just be aware that the consumer base is going to be using less energy over time, and more of that energy is going to be electricity.
Very insightful. Dr. Considine, do you have a quick comment?
Yeah, 3 quick ideas. First, attack of the Lilliputians. You're going to have the regulatory state come down on the oil and gas industry from the federal and state level. It's already happening in Colorado, where you have all these rule makings, one every 2 or 3 months, and it increases the cumulative costs of production. Okay. Second point involves, I agree with taxation is going to be a big issue. Another is the greenhouse gas emission roadmaps that are being looked at in states like Colorado, where they're being driven by mandates and standards. States are outlawing internal combustion engines and so on. There's an entire there's been a sea change in the regulatory approach over the past generation, where we've adopted standards and mandates and have done it. We've ignored cost benefit criteria for evaluating policies. And I think the federal statutes and state statutes that are on the books for cost benefit analysis should be dusted off, and lawmakers should consider, hey, what do the statutes say about doing a cost benefit analysis on these policies? And
Okay.
those would be my suggestions.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jodey, for those great questions, and thank you for your participation this morning too, as well again for Congresswoman Cheney. I really appreciated her presence here today. But I got to say, the panelists we've had this morning have been awesome. You guys are great, tremendous information. And I, excuse me, I really appreciate you speaking on behalf of our nation's energy and our economy. So thank you very much. And I got to tell you, I'm humbled and delighted that we as members of the Western Caucus can amplify and lift up your voices. I think all Americans need to hear what you're saying. So we're going to do our best to accomplish that. And I'd like to thank everyone for watching this morning. It's a tremendously important topic. And I encourage everyone to please tune in for part 3 of our series, which will be on Tuesday, March 2nd at 11 a.m. Eastern time. We're going to look into the severe labor and workforce impacts stemming from some of these reckless executive orders. We're going to have Representative Pete Stauber from the state of Minnesota, as well as Representative Don Bacon from the state of Nebraska. So again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Yeah.